Franska Podden presenteras av Frankrikes ambassad i Sverige.
It's a pleasure to have with me today Jacques Lapouge, current ambassador of France to Sweden, who has previously served as French ambassador for climate change negotiations. And in this podcast, he will tell us more about COP21 that will take place in Paris from November 30th to December 11th, and which is a crucial UN conference on the climate that France will be hosting and presiding. Mr. Ambassador, there's huge media coverage in Sweden on COP21, but it is not always that easy for non-experts to understand what really is at stake. Could you help us figuring out what this conference is really about?
Perhaps we could start with the meaning of COP21. COP means Conference of the Parties, and it's the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, which was signed in 1992 and which entered into force in 1994, 21 years ago, which means that every year the ministers of the parties to the conference meet, usually in December, in order to see how to implement the convention and to sign agreement in order to fight climate change. And that's why it's COP21. It's a number 21 conference. The goal of the convention, of course, was to contain the warming of the planet and the climate disruptions. I'm sure everybody knows the main figures, but for example, the increase in temperature since 1880 was plus 0.85 degrees. And the last 30 years have been the warmest since 1400. As you know, the fifth IPCC report, the IPCC is this college of scientists from all over the world which studied the data on climate change. And it stated that if we follow the business as usual scenarios, if we don't change anything, the temperature should rise between 2.3 degrees and 5.7 degrees at the end of this century. And so the consequences, of course, would be extreme meteorological events, huge sanitary problems, problem for the access to water, in particular in the developing countries, but also problem of security. And we have to be aware that with climate change, the number of climate refugees would increase massively. And there is a consensus on the need to limit the increase of temperature to 2 degrees, to consider that over 2 degrees it would be really very dangerous. So the international community has tried since we signed the UNFCCC convention to find an agreement between all the countries to limit and to reduce their greenhouse gas emission, but also to find an agreement on the policies to adapt to climate change and on the means of implementation for that, because you need finance, you need transfer of technology, and you need to develop the capacities, in particular of the poor countries, to fight climate change. So there have been quite a number of agreements in the history of the negotiation, and I'm sure you remember the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, which was very important, because it was the first legally binding agreement to reduce greenhouse gases. But it was applied only by developed countries, and not all of them. So it was not enough. It was not enough because what we could see in the recent years was that more and more developing countries, and in particular the emerging countries, were taking a bigger part in the world emission of greenhouse gases. That's why we tried in Copenhagen in 2009 to expand the agreement to all countries. I won't have time to enter into detail, but as you know, Copenhagen was not a complete success. It produced some interesting results, but it was not enough. And so we decided that in 2015 we should try again to conclude a universal agreement, legally binding, and that would be consistent with this objective of a maximum of 2 degree increase in temperatures. So we have started the negotiation in the last 3 years with a lot of formal negotiation in Bonn, which is the headquarters of the Secretariat of the Convention, and some COPs in Warsaw 2 years ago, in Lima last year, with the objective of concluding the agreement in Paris.
Could you explain to us what the main parameters of the negotiations are?
We have 4 objectives for Paris. I will list them and then I will come back briefly on each of them. First, to conclude an agreement, then to have as ambitious as possible commitment of greenhouse gases reduction from all the participants. The third one is the funding, to raise enough money to fight climate change. And the fourth one is what we call the agenda of solution, because it's very important that all the actors, and not only the government, but also the business, the cities, the citizens, can showcase their initiative. So first, the agreement. It's at the heart of the negotiation. And it's very important to set in an agreement the rules that all the participants must follow on their commitments, on the reporting on their commitment, on the transparency, but also on adaptation, on finance, on means of implementation. So it's the set of common rules that the 195 parties to the negotiation will follow in the future. So this text is negotiated in a UN group, and we have formal negotiation, informal one, and the goal is to have in Paris a concise text, not too many pages, and a few decisions, but which should be clear, understandable by everybody, universal, fair, because of course there is an important principle called the principle of differentiation, where the rules are adapted to the level of development of each country. You don't expect from India the same kind of commitment than from European Union, for example. So this is the first result we expect in Paris. It's this agreement. The second result are the commitments on greenhouse gas reduction. We had decided that all the countries should table their commitments before the conference in Paris, so that we have time to assess them. And the result is pretty good at that time, because more than 150 countries, including all the big emitters and covering 87% of the emissions in the world, including the EU, of course, the US and China, all these commitments have been tabled. The EU, for example, has committed to reduce its emission by 40% in 2030 compared to 1990. So this is a good result. But the question is whether the addition of all this commitment is consistent with the target of a maximum increase of temperature of 2 degrees. It's a little early to tell because we will have more commitment, and we are expecting a study from the Secretariat of the Convention which will analyze all this commitment. I'm sure you've seen some studies which show that it should be more than 2 degrees, perhaps 2.7 or 3 degrees. But what's important is to devise in the agreement a mechanism which will compel us to review regularly the commitment with rule of no backsliding. You cannot go backwards on your commitment, so as to be sure that in the future, if we are not on the trajectory of 2 degrees, we will be able to come back to this trajectory before the end of the century. And that's one of the things we have to work on before Paris. The third goal is funding, because we need money, in particular for the developing country. We need money for adaptation, for investing in renewable, for investing in energy efficiency. In Copenhagen, the developed countries had promised that they would transfer $100 billion of funding from the north to the south, private and public funding, from 2020. So we have to be able to assure in Paris, in particular to the developing country, that we will fulfill this commitment and that this money will be transferred. Already we have capitalized the Green Climate Fund to more than $10 billion, which is a very important result. And the fourth goal in Paris is to be able to showcase a convincing agenda of solution, because the government are important, but the non-governmental actors, the non-state actors, the company, the region, the city, the citizens are as important because they lead by example. And if we can show in Paris, we have opened a portal in the UN website, which is called NASCA, where everybody can register its initiative, individually or collectively. We will be able to show that a movement has been created and that we are really going toward a new clean world and economy.
So to conclude, does this mean that you are optimistic about the possibility to reach a good agreement?
Well, it's true that in addition to all these elements I've given you on the contribution, on the funding, there are a number of positive trends. And the first positive one, of course, is the general awareness of the risks, the consensus of the scientists and of the politics on the diagnosis and on the target of 2 degrees. It was not the case a few decades ago. It's really very clear. And so the consequence is the mobilization of the political leaders, all the leaders. The leaders in all the countries want an agreement and think an agreement is very important. But not only the leader, the moral authorities. You've seen the encyclical of the Pope, for example, and it's the same for all the religion. So there is a real political mobilization. Another interesting element is the acknowledgement that fighting climate change is not only a cost, but also an opportunity to develop new technologies and to develop profitable activities. We can see more and more companies engage spontaneously in this new climate economy, and they create jobs with that. So the mood is not at all what it was again a few years ago when people say, well, fighting climate change is very expensive. It's contrary to the goal of growth. No, it could be a new source of growth, fighting climate change. Another positive element is that we see the emergence of a middle ground between the countries from the north and the south. Traditionally, in this kind of negotiation in the UN, there are different views between developed and developing countries. And you still have differences, but you see that there is a common awareness of the necessity to work together. And, for example, we had this very important agreement last year between China and the United States. They are the 2 biggest emitters and the most important economic powerhouses. And they agreed on the common target. So there are reasons to be confident. But on the other hand, we have to be cautious. We just have 1 month left and still a lot of work to do. The negotiation of the text is not finalized. The text we have is still too long with a lot of options. It is a difficult negotiation because it's a negotiation by consensus where every one of the 196 parties had the possibility to disagree. So it's difficult. It's difficult. We are still expecting commitment from some countries. We need more promises of funding, and we just have 1 month left. And definitely we need to accelerate and to stay mobilized.
As earlier mentioned, France will be hosting and presiding this conference. More precisely, what does that mean? What is France's role and responsibility in this?
Well, first, as the host country, the COP is the huge challenge of organization. We will welcome more than 40,000 people in Le Bourget, which is 20 minutes north of Paris, 20,000 delegates and 20,000 representatives of the civil societies. So it means a lot of things to plan for on transport, on hotels, and we will do that in a very green way. Of course, that's the least we could do. And I'm sure everybody will be convinced by the kind of organization we have decided. We will also organize an unprecedented sequence of events in Paris to give visibility to the initiative of all the actors, with a lot of conferences, side events, exhibition for the companies, for the city. In particular, the 5th of December, which will be the Action Day, where quite a number of prominent people from all walks of life will come to Paris to show and to say how important it is to fight climate change and to showcase their activities. This is for the organization. But, of course, at the presidency, France also has an important role in the substance and an important political role. We cannot do anything. We are just the presidency, and again, it's a UN negotiation by consensus, and it's a parties-driven negotiation. It's not for the presidency, of course, to decide of the result, as you can imagine. But we have a major political role. There is a huge mobilization of the French authorities, of the President of the Republic, of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, of the Minister of Ecology. It's on top of the agenda of all the meetings they have, either bilateral or multilateral, in the G7, in the G20, in the UN General Assembly. Everywhere they put climate change as the first issue and try to convince their partners. In addition, we have organized many informal meetings in parallel to the formal negotiations. And we have decided, the French president, has decided to invite all the leaders of the world on the first day of the negotiation, on the 30th of November. Not at the end, because we consider it's not for the leaders to negotiate the details of the text. It's for the official and then for the minister. But at the first day of the conference, in order to give the political impulse to the negotiators.
Last question. What role is Sweden playing in this negotiation, and what has been your role as French ambassador to Sweden to raise awareness among the Swedes on fighting climate change?
Well, first of all, Sweden is an example in the fight against climate change. Its electricity mix is one of the most virtuous, with a very, very small percentage of energy of carbon origin. Its big companies and investment funds are also on the forefront to decarbonize. They are taking a lot of initiative. Its big cities, Stockholm, Göteborg, and others everywhere, are also exemplary, creating eco-district. Yesterday, for example, I was in Västerbotten, where the prefecture organized a consultation on climate change in the prefecture, in the region, and they asked me to contribute to the debate. And there are many, many debates of this kind. Sweden is also very generous in the fight against climate change. It's the first donor per capita to the Green Climate Fund. So Sweden is the strong support of the presidency of the COP, France, and thanks to its diplomatic network and very good relation with many countries, we know that we can count on their negotiators to support an ambitious result in Paris. As for the role of the embassy and my role personally, I wouldn't say that we have to raise awareness, because, again, the Swedes are very aware of the issue, but to explain our strategy in Paris, for Paris, as I'm doing now. And I have taken part to, around 20 conferences this year, organized by think tanks, universities, student associations of companies, in particular to explain how everyone can be part of COP21 and how they can register the initiative for Paris. So, yes, that's been a big part of my activity this year. And, of course, during the COP itself, we will try to inform as well as possible all the Swedes on what's going on in Paris, hoping that the result will be good, because we don't have any other choice. We need a good result in Paris.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you to you.
Franska podden presenteras av Frankrikes ambassad i Sverige. Franska podden presenteras av Frankrikes ambassad i Sverige.
It's a pleasure to have with me today Jacques Lapouge, current ambassador of France to Sweden, who has previously served as French ambassador for climate change negotiations. And in this podcast, he will tell us more about COP21 that will take place in Paris from November 30th to December 11th. And which is a crucial UN conference on the climate that France will be hosting and presiding. Mr. Ambassador, there's huge media coverage in Sweden on COP21, but it is not always that easy for non-experts to understand what really is at stake. Could you help us figuring out what this conference is really about?
Perhaps we could start with the meaning of COP21. COP means